At 2 a.m., the do not cough sign feels less like a suggestion and more like a dire warning. Welcome to my new job, deep within the echoing halls of Indiana's most mysterious library, where the silence is absolute and the rules, well, they're not in any book you've ever read. This isn't just a shift. It's a descent into the peculiar. The Holloway Memorial Library sits at the edge of Crestwood, Indiana, like a tombstone marking the boundary between the living town and something older, something that predates the neat suburban streets and chain restaurants. I'd driven past it 100 times during the day, barely noticing the Gothic Revival building with its limestone facade and narrow windows that look more like arrow slits than anything meant to let in light. But at night, when the sodium streetlights cast everything in sickly orange, the library transforms into something else entirely. The building seems to lean forward, hungry, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be here. 3 months ago, I was finishing my graduate degree in archival science, sending out applications to museums and universities, imagining a career surrounded by history, but firmly rooted in the present. Then my student loans came due, my roommate moved out, and my car needed a new transmission. Desperation has a way of narrowing your options. When I saw the posting for an overnight archivist position at the Holloway Memorial Library, the pay was almost obscene for a small-town gig. $35 an hour to essentially babysit old books from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week. No public interaction, no programming responsibilities, just preservation and inventory. The interview was conducted over email. No video call, no phone screening, just a series of increasingly strange questions. Could I work in complete silence? Was I comfortable with buildings that settled at night? Did I have any respiratory conditions that might cause involuntary coughing? That last question should have been a red flag, but I needed the money badly enough to ignore the whisper of intuition telling me to keep scrolling. My first night was a Tuesday in late September. I arrived at 9:45 p.m., early enough to meet the day's supervisor before she left. Patricia Hendricks was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. She met me at the staff entrance, a heavy oak door set into the side of the building, away from the main entrance that the public used during regular hours. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. Not gradually, but all at once, like walking into a meat locker. Patricia noticed my shiver and smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes were tired, shadowed by dark circles that spoke of poor sleep or something worse. "You'll get used to the cold," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, even though we were alone. "The heating system is original to the building, from 1904. It doesn't work well at night." She led me through a narrow hallway lined with dark wood paneling. Our footsteps echoed despite the carpet runner, and I noticed that Patricia walked carefully, deliberately, as if afraid of making too much noise. The hallway opened into the main reading room, a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow above us. Rows of wooden tables stretched across the floor, each with a small reading lamp that cast a weak pool of light. But most of the room remained dark, the corners filled with the kind of blackness that feels solid, impenetrable. The shelves rose along the walls like canyon cliffs, accessible by rolling ladders that looked like medieval torture devices. Books filled every inch of space, their spines creating a patchwork of colors that faded to gray in the dim light. The smell hit me next. Old paper, leather, and something underneath that I couldn't identify. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. "Let me show you the rules," Patricia said, walking to a corkboard near what I assumed was the circulation desk. She pulled out a laminated sheet and handed it to me. "Read this carefully. These aren't suggestions." I took the paper, expecting standard library policies. No food or drink, reshelve books properly, lock the doors at closing. Instead, I found something else entirely. Overnight shift regulations. Maintain absolute silence after 11 p.m. No talking, no humming, no whistling. Do not cough between the hours of 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you hear whispering, do not attempt to locate the source. The third floor stacks are off limits between midnight and 4 a.m. If a book falls from a shelf on its own, leave it where it falls until morning. Do not look directly at the portrait in the reference room. If you see someone reading at one of the tables, do not approach them. The basement door must remain closed at all times that the lights flicker 3 times in succession. Move to a different section of the library immediately. Under no circumstances should you answer if someone calls your name. I read the list twice, certain it was some kind of hazing ritual for new employees. I looked up at Patricia, expecting her to smile and tell me this was a joke. Instead, she stared at me with an expression of absolute seriousness. "I know how this looks," she said quietly, "but these rules exist for a reason. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine. The library has been here for over a century. It has its ways. What happens if I break one of the rules?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, as if this was all very reasonable. Patricia's face went carefully blank. "Nothing good. The last night archivist lasted 3 weeks. The one before that made it almost 2 months. What happened to them?" "They left," Patricia said simply. "They couldn't handle it. The work. The atmosphere. Some people aren't cut out for this particular position." She gave me a quick tour after that, pointing out the various sections and explaining the basic inventory system I'd be maintaining. The Dewey Decimal System had been abandoned long ago in favor of a proprietary organizational method that seemed designed to be as confusing as possible. Books were grouped by acquisition date, subject matter, and something Patricia called sensitivity level, which she refused to elaborate on. The reference room made my skin crawl the moment I stepped inside. It was smaller than the main reading area, lined with glass-fronted cases containing what looked like rare manuscripts and first editions. Above the marble fireplace hung a portrait of a man in Victorian-era clothing. He had a severe face, with deep-set eyes that seemed to follow movement. I found myself looking at it despite not wanting to, drawn by the painting's strange intensity. "That's Jeremiah Holloway," Patricia said from behind me, making me jump. "He founded the library, donated his personal collection and the funds to build this place. Some people say he never really left." Rule number 6 suddenly made more sense, though not in a way that comforted me. By the time Patricia left at 10:15 p.m., I was having serious second thoughts about the job, but she handed me an envelope with my first week's pay in advance, cash, which felt both generous and slightly ominous. The money was real enough. I tucked it into my bag and watched her walk quickly toward the staff exit, her footsteps echoing through the empty building. Then I was alone. The silence descended like a physical weight. I've been in quiet places before, libraries and churches and museums after hours, but this was different. This wasn't just the absence of sound. This was silence with presence, with intention. It pressed against my eardrums, made me hyper-aware of my own breathing, the rustle of my clothes, the creak of the floorboards under my feet. I sat up at the circulation desk, pulling out my laptop and the inventory list Patricia had given me. The task seemed straightforward enough. Work through each section, verify the books against the database, note any damage or missing volumes. Start with the ground floor, work my way up. Avoid the third floor until after 4 a.m. Simple. At 10:47 p.m., I heard the first whisper. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Just a susurration of sound, like wind through leaves, except there was no wind inside the building. I froze, listening, my heart suddenly beating faster. The sound came again, slightly louder. I could almost make out words. Almost, but not quite. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the vast reading room. Rule number 3 flashed through my mind. If you hear whispering, do not attempt to locate the source. I forced myself to focus on my computer screen, on the mundane task of checking book titles against catalog numbers. The whispering continued for another minute, then faded away, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier than before. Welcome to the Holloway Memorial Library, I thought, where the rules are bizarre, the silence is absolute, and the night shift is just beginning. I had 7 hours and 13 minutes until sunrise. Something told me it was going to be the longest night of my life. The first hour passed in relative calm, though calm is a relative term when you're alone in a building that seems to be breathing around you. I worked through the first section of the ground floor, scanning barcodes and checking condition reports, trying to focus on the mechanical nature of the task. Every few minutes, I'd glance at the rules list taped to the desk beside my laptop. The words seemed to shift in the dim light, taking on new and more sinister meanings with each reading. At 11:32 p.m., the lights flickered once. Just once, but enough to make my hand freeze over the keyboard. I counted in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The lights remained steady. Rule number 9 specified 3 flickers in succession. This was only 1. I was fine. I exhaled slowly and returned to my work, but my shoulders wouldn't relax. The architecture of the Holloway Memorial Library seemed designed to cultivate unease. The main reading room fed into a maze of smaller chambers and alcoves, each dedicated to different subjects or time periods. The fiction section occupied what had once been a music room, complete with a raised platform where a piano must have sat. Now empty shelves created shadows within shadows, and the wooden floor creaked with every step, announcing my presence to whatever might be listening. I discovered quickly that the silence requirement wasn't arbitrary. Sound behaved strangely in this building. When I accidentally knocked a pen off the desk at 11:45 p.m., the clatter seemed to echo for impossibly long, bouncing off walls and ceilings, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen pins falling in sequence. The noise finally faded, but in its wake came something worse, the sense that something had heard it, that my clumsiness had attracted attention. The whispering started again at 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the absolute silence rule kicked in. This time, I heard distinct words, though they made no sense. The language sounded old, guttural, nothing like modern English or any foreign language I recognized. The whispers came from the direction of the reference room, where Jeremiah Holloway's portrait watched over his collection. I remembered Patricia's warning about not looking directly at the painting and wondered if the two were connected. When midnight arrived, the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. I could see my breath in the lamplight, small clouds of vapor that dissipated slowly, reluctantly. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to focus on the screen, but my eyes kept drifting to the spaces between the shelves, the dark corners where the light didn't quite reach. I'd never experienced such absolute darkness indoors. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was darkness with texture, with depth, as if the shadows were made of something more substantial than the absence of illumination. At 12:23 a.m., I witnessed my first impossible thing. I was walking through the history section, checking the condition of a series of local county records from the 1890s, when a book fell from the shelf to my right. Not tumbled or slipped, but fell with deliberate force, hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. I jumped backward, my heart slamming against my ribs, and stared at the fallen volume. It was a leather-bound journal, unmarked, with pages yellowed by age. Rule number 5 was explicit. If a book falls from a shelf on its own, leave it where it falls until morning. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and fear can sometimes sharpen rather than dull it. I crouched down, not touching the book, but examining it from inches away. The journal had fallen open to a page covered in cramped handwriting. Even in the dim light, I could make out the date at the top. November 3rd, 1904, the year the library opened. My eyes scanned the visible text. The collection grows restless after dark. The arrangement I made with JH may have been premature. The price he paid, the price we all pay, is steeper than I imagined. The sounds from the third floor have intensified. Tonight, I heard my name called 13 times. Tomorrow, I will seal the basement door. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. The journal lay there, innocent and damning, a historical artifact that shouldn't exist but clearly did. I backed away, following the rule, leaving it where it had fallen. But the words stayed with me, burning in my mind. What arrangement? What price? And why seal the basement door? The basement door. Rule number 8. The basement door must remain closed at all times. I hadn't been shown where the basement door was located. Patricia's tour had been deliberately vague about certain areas, steering me away from some sections while emphasizing others. Now I understood why. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Some questions were better left unasked. At 1:15 a.m., I encountered the lady in the reading room. I'd returned to the circulation desk to log my progress when I noticed her. She sat at one of the wooden tables, third row from the front, perfectly still, reading a book by the light of the small lamp. She wore what looked like a long dress from another era, dark fabric that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Her hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that would have taken hours to arrange. She didn't move, didn't turn pages, just sat there with her head bowed over the book. Rule number 7. If you see someone reading at one of the tables, do not approach them. My rational mind tried to explain her presence. Maybe Patricia hadn't actually left. Maybe there was another staff member I hadn't met. Maybe the library had special late-night access for certain patrons. But my instincts knew better. The figure at the table wasn't quite solid. The edges of her seemed to blur slightly, to waver like heat shimmer off summer pavement. And she cast no shadow, despite the lamp burning just above her bent head. I forced myself to look away, to return to my computer, to act as if I'd seen nothing unusual. But peripheral vision has a way of betraying us, and I couldn't help noticing that she remained absolutely motionless. No breath, no fidgeting, no subtle shifts of position that living people make unconsciously. She simply sat, reading, forever reading, trapped in a moment that had long since passed. 20 minutes later, when I glanced back, she was gone. The chairs sat empty, the lamp still burning, and there was no way she could have left without me hearing. The floor creaked when a mouse crossed it. A person moving would have sounded like thunder. At 1:47 a.m., I heard footsteps on the second floor. They were measured and deliberate, the sound of leather-soled shoes on hardwood, back and forth, pacing, as if someone was walking the length of the second-floor gallery. I stood at the base of the grand staircase, looking up into darkness, listening to the impossible footsteps. They continued for exactly 3 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as they'd started. The rules didn't mention footsteps. Did that mean I should investigate? Or did the blanket maintain silence, rule apply to responding to sounds as well as making them? I decided that discretion was the better part of valor and returned to my inventory work, though my hand shook as I scanned the next row of books. At 2 a.m. exactly, I felt the urge to cough. It came on suddenly, a tickle in the back of my throat that grew rapidly into a burning need. I'd read rule number 2 a dozen times. Do not cough between the hours of 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. It had seemed absurd when I first saw it, the kind of arbitrary restriction that made no sense. Now, with the need building in my chest, I understood that this rule was designed to test me, or to protect me, possibly both. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to suppress the urge, but it only grew stronger. My eyes watered. My throat burned. Every instinct screamed at me to cough, to clear the obstruction, to breathe properly. 60 minutes. I just had to hold out for 60 minutes. The burning intensified. I walked quickly to the staff bathroom, a small windowless room that smelled of ancient plumbing and industrial cleaner. I turned on the faucet, letting the sound of running water mask any noise I might make, and carefully, quietly, clear my throat in the smallest way possible. Not a cough, not technically, just a whisper of breath, the barest clearing of airways. The urge subsided slightly, but didn't disappear. I splashed cold water on my face, stared at my reflection in the age-spotted mirror, and saw that my face had gone pale, my pupils dilated with adrenaline. I looked like someone being hunted. Maybe I was. When I returned to the main reading room at 2:09 a.m., the woman was back at the table, but now she was looking directly at me. Her face was gray, drained of all color and life. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark holes that seemed to pull at my vision, trying to draw me in. Her mouth opened slowly, and though no sound emerged, I could see her lips forming words. Read with me. Stay with me. Read forever. I looked away immediately, breaking eye contact, following rule number 7 with newfound urgency. Do not approach them. Don't even acknowledge them. Pretend they're not there. Even when every cell in your body is screaming that something dead and wrong is sitting 20 feet away, trying to make you join it in its eternal vigil. I spent the next 40 minutes in the staff kitchen, a cramped room with a microwave and a small table, doing busy work on my laptop, and absolutely refusing to go back into the reading room until I was certain she'd be gone. At 2:53 a.m., with 7 minutes left in the no-coughing window, the urge returned with vicious intensity. I gripped the edge of the table, breathing through my nose, counting down the seconds. When 3 a.m. arrived, I let out the breath I'd been holding and coughed once, twice, 3 times. The relief was extraordinary, but so was the sudden silence that followed. Every ambient sound in the building cut off simultaneously. The hum of the old HVAC system, the tick of the antique clock in the reading room, even the settling creaks of the ancient timber. Everything stopped. In that absolute vacuum of sound, I heard a door open somewhere in the building. Not the creak of old hinges, but the solid, deliberate sound of a door being pushed open by someone with purpose. The sound came from above me, from the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor stacks are off limits between midnight and 4 a.m. Someone, or something, had just broken the rules, and they'd done it the moment the no coughing restriction lifted, as if they'd been waiting. I sat in the staff kitchen, my hands trembling, and realized that the rules weren't just arbitrary restrictions. They were a schedule, a timetable that dictated when certain things could happen, when certain boundaries could be crossed. The rules were keeping something contained, keeping it on a schedule, preventing it from having free run of the building. And I just learned that whatever followed the rules from its side expected me to follow them from mine. This was a contract, an agreement between the living and something else. Break the rules, and all bets were off. For hours until sunrise. For hours until Patricia returned, and I could ask her the questions that were burning in my mind. For hours to survive whatever walked the 3rd floor in the dark hours before dawn. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected in a building with walls 3 feet thick. But I still had the rules list, and I planned to follow every single one of them to the letter. My curiosity had limits, and I just found them. The hours between 3 a.m. and dawn are when the world feels thinnest, when the boundary between what is and what shouldn't be becomes permeable. I'd read about the witching hour in folklore classes, dismissed it as superstition born from human circadian rhythms and our primitive fear of darkness. Now, sitting alone in the Holloway Memorial Library with something walking the 3rd floor above me, I understood that some superstitions exist because they're based on terrible truths. At 3:17 a.m., the whispers returned, but this time they were different, clearer, more insistent. They no longer came from a single direction, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the building's stones had learned to speak. I remained in the staff kitchen, the only room that felt remotely safe, and tried to focus on documenting the evening's inventory progress. But the whispers penetrated everything, working their way into my concentration like water finding cracks in stone. I could almost understand them now. Not the actual words, but the emotion behind them. Longing, desperation, a plea that had been repeated so many times it had worn grooves into reality itself. Whatever was whispering wanted something from me, needed something, and the intensity of that need made my skin crawl. The footsteps overhead continued, following a pattern. 12 steps forward, pause, 12 steps back. Over and over, tireless and mechanical. I counted them obsessively, finding strange comfort in their predictability. As long as they stayed upstairs, as long as they maintained their pattern, I could pretend I was safe. At 3:34 a.m., my laptop screen flickered and went dark. The battery indicator had shown 47% just seconds before. I pressed the power button. Nothing. The device was completely dead, as if something had drained it instantly. I sat in the dim kitchen light, now completely cut off from the distraction of work, with nothing to do but listen to the building breathe around me. That's when I noticed the photographs. The staff kitchen had a small corkboard on the wall, the kind offices everywhere use for memos and announcements. In the corner, partially hidden behind a health department certificate, was a collection of old photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. I glanced at them earlier, but hadn't really looked. Now, with nothing else to occupy my attention, I stood and examined them more carefully. The first showed the library's grand opening in 1904. A crowd of well-dressed people stood on the front steps, their faces serious in the way of old photographs where subjects had to hold still for long exposures. In the center stood Jeremiah Holloway, his severe features matching the portrait in the reference room. But it was the woman beside him that made my breath catch. She wore a dark dress, her hair pinned up in an elaborate style. The same woman I'd seen reading at the table. The same gray face. The same empty eyes, even in the photograph. The caption, written in faded ink on the photo's border, read, "Jeremiah Holloway with his daughter, Elizabeth, at the library dedication." The second photograph showed the interior of the library, circa 1920s, based on the clothing of the few visible patrons. But something about the image was wrong. In the background, barely visible between two shelves, was a door. A heavy door with iron banding, the kind you'd expect to see in a medieval castle, not a library. The kind of door meant to keep something in or something out. The basement door. The third photograph made my hands shake. It showed a group of library staff from 1947, all women, standing in front of the circulation desk. They wore similar expressions, tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and every single one of them looked exhausted, haunted. The caption identified them as night staff. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in pencil, "Only 3 lasted more than a month." The darkness takes its toll. I was staring at my predecessors, women who had stood where I was standing, who had heard what I was hearing, who had felt the same creeping dread that now filled my chest. And they'd been broken by it, worn down until they couldn't continue. At 3:52 a.m., someone called my name. The voice came from the reading room, clear and distinct, cutting through the whispers like a knife. It was a woman's voice, cultured and cold, with an accent that spoke of old money and older traditions. "Alex," it called. "Come read with me, Alex. The night is so long, and I've been alone for so very long. Rule number 10. Under no circumstances should you answer if someone calls your name." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice penetrated, impossible to block out. "Alex, don't be rude. I know you're here. I can smell the warmth of you, the life. Come share it with me. Come sit at my table and read until morning. Read until forever." The urge to respond was overwhelming. Every social instinct screamed at me that ignoring someone was impolite, wrong. But I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood and remained silent, frozen in the kitchen, waiting for the voice to give up. It didn't give up. It changed tactics. Your grandmother would be disappointed in such rudeness, Alex. She taught you better. She taught you to respect your elders, to help those in need. I need you, Alex. I need you so desperately. The reading is lonely work, and the words blur after a century. Lend me your young eyes. Lend me your vitality. Just for a little while. Just until dawn. How did it know about my grandmother? She died 3 years ago. Had indeed been the one who taught me manners and respect and the importance of helping others. But she'd also been the one who taught me about intuition, about trusting the little voice that says something isn't right. That voice was screaming now. At 4 a.m. exactly. The footsteps overhead stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. I could picture whatever walked up there pausing at the top of the stairs, deciding whether to descend. According to the rules, the 3rd floor was now accessible again. That meant I could go up there if I wanted to. It also meant that whatever had been confined there was now free to roam. I heard the creak of weight on the grand staircase. Slow, deliberate descending. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, each one announced with a groan of ancient wood that echoed through the building. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, counting the steps. The main staircase had 23 stairs. I knew because I'd climbed them during Patricia's tour. At step 15, the descent stopped. Something stood in the middle of the staircase, between floors, neither up nor down. Waiting, listening, searching. I could feel its attention sweeping through the building like a searchlight, probing for signs of life, for the warmth and movement that would betray my location. The whispers intensified, becoming almost deafening in their volume, though they remained just below the threshold of intelligibility. They came from everywhere now, a chorus of voices overlapping and intertwining, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to pull on my consciousness, trying to draw me out of my hiding place. At 4:09 a.m., the lights in the kitchen flickered. Once, twice. My heart stopped. If they flickered a 3rd time, I was supposed to move to a different section immediately. But where? The reading room had Elizabeth Holloway. The staircase had something descending from the 3rd floor. The reference room had Jeremiah's portrait and whatever it watched over. The light steadied. Only 2 flickers. I released the breath I'd been holding and tried to slow my racing heart. The rules were precise. They meant exactly what they said. No more, no less. 2 flickers meant nothing. 2 flickers were safe. At 4:23 a.m., I made a decision. I couldn't hide in the kitchen until dawn. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to find some explanation that would help me survive not just this night, but the 3 more shifts I was contracted for each week. The money was good, but no amount of money was worth losing my sanity, or worse. I crept out of the kitchen and made my way to the circulation desk, moving as silently as possible. My laptop was still dead, but Patricia had left several file boxes containing the library's administrative records. If I wanted answers about this place, about Jeremiah Holloway and his daughter and the mysterious basement, the paper trail would tell me. The reading room was empty now. No gray woman at the table. No phantom reader trapped in eternal study. Just rows of silent furniture and shelves that disappeared in a shadow. But I could feel her presence lingering, like the cold spot that remains in a room after a window has been closed. I found what I was looking for in the 3rd box I opened. Personnel records dating back to the library's founding. The files were meticulously kept, recording every employee who had ever worked at the Holloway Memorial Library. I started with the night staff, the people whose job I had inherited. The pattern was immediate and disturbing. Since 1904, the library had employed 137 night archivists. The average tenure was 3 weeks. Many lasted only days. Several had been hospitalized for nervous exhaustion. 2 had died, though the causes were listed vaguely as heart failure and sudden illness. None had left detailed accounts of why they quit, just brief resignation letters citing unsuitable working conditions or personal reasons. But one file was different. A woman named Dorothy Marsh had worked the night shift for 6 months in 1952, the longest tenure on record. Her file was thick, filled with incident reports and correspondence with the library board. I pulled out the pages and began reading by the light of my phone's flashlight. Dorothy's reports started normally enough, documenting the inventory work and maintenance tasks expected of the position. But around week 3, the tone changed. She began noting anomalous occurrences, books falling, unexplained sounds, temperature fluctuations. The board's responses were dismissive, attributing everything to the building's age and Dorothy's overactive imagination. By month 4, Dorothy's reports became frantic. She wrote about seeing Elizabeth Holloway, about hearing voices calling her name, about the footsteps on the 3rd floor. She documented everything I'd experienced and more. She'd found a fallen journal, had read about Jeremiah's arrangement, and she'd done what I was too afraid to do. She'd researched the library's history, digging into newspaper archives and historical records. What she found was documented in a 10-page report dated June 15, 1952. I read it with growing horror. Jeremiah Holloway had been obsessed with immortality, with preserving knowledge and beauty forever. His daughter Elizabeth had been a brilliant scholar, fluent in 8 languages, a voracious reader with a photographic memory. When she fell ill with tuberculosis in 1903, given months to live, Jeremiah had made a bargain. Not with God, Dorothy's research suggested, but with something older, something that had existed in the land beneath the library long before the building was erected. The details were vague, culled from oblique references in Jeremiah's personal correspondence and the journals of his contemporaries. But the essential truth was clear. Jeremiah had bound his daughter's spirit to the library, trapping her in eternal half-life, forever reading, forever learning, never aging, never dying, never living. Patricia made coffee in the staff kitchen, the mundane domesticity of the act surreal after the horrors of the night. She used an old percolator that looked like it belonged in a museum, and the bitter smell of cheap grounds filled the small room. Morning light filtered through the narrow window, making the kitchen look dingy and ordinary, nothing like the nightmare realm it had felt like just an hour before. "The written rules are for your protection," Patricia began, handing me a chipped mug. "They keep you safe from the obvious dangers, the things that everyone encounters. But there are other rules, unwritten ones, that you need to know if you're going to survive more than a few nights." I wrapped my hands around the mug, savoring its warmth, and listened. First, never bring anything personal into the building. No photographs, no jewelry with sentimental value, nothing that connects you emotionally to the outside world. They can use those connections against you, make you see things that aren't there, hear voices of people you love. The more disconnected you are, the less they can manipulate you. I thought about the voice that had mentioned my grandmother and felt cold despite the coffee. Second, map the building during your first week. Learn every exit, every window, every possible escape route. The architecture changes at night. Doors that exist during the day disappear after midnight. Hallways that led one place will take you somewhere else entirely. You need to know the stable routes, the paths that don't shift. The building changes. I interrupted, my voice cracking slightly. Patricia nodded grimly. The binding that keeps Elizabeth trapped doesn't just affect her. It warps the space itself, makes the library larger on the inside than it should be. There are rooms that exist only at certain hours, hallways that appear and disappear. The 3rd floor is the worst. Sometimes it has 5 rooms, sometimes 12. Dorothy Marsh documented this extensively. She even drew maps, though they became less and less useful as she realized the layout was fluid. I absorbed this information, my mind struggling to accept what she was telling me. Buildings didn't change shape. Space didn't warp. These were fundamental physical laws. But then again, dead women didn't read at tables, and footsteps didn't walk through empty floors. Third, Patricia continued, never, ever try to help Elizabeth. I know it's tempting. She's been trapped here for over a century, and part of you want to free her, to end her suffering. But the binding is all that keeps this place from becoming something much worse. If you break it, if you free her, you'll unleash whatever Jeremiah made his bargain with. The thing in the basement. Trust me, Elizabeth's imprisonment is the lesser evil. What is in the basement? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Patricia's face went pale. I don't know exactly. I've never been down there, and neither has anyone else in living memory. The door has been sealed since 1947, after an incident with a night archivist who tried to investigate. They found her 3 days later, catatonic, and she never spoke again. She spent the rest of her life in an institution, and the only thing she ever wrote, over and over on the walls of her room, was "It's still hungry." The coffee turned to acid in my stomach. Fourth, and this is crucial, never acknowledge that you believe. If anyone asks, during the day, about your experiences at night, you must deny everything. Claim it was just the buildings settling, your imagination, sleep deprivation. The library board knows the truth, but there's a collective agreement to maintain the fiction that everything is normal. If you start talking openly about what happens here, they'll fire you immediately and make sure you never work in any archive or library again. They protect this secret viciously. Why? Why not just close the library? Burn it down if necessary. Patricia laughed bitterly. Because Jeremiah Holloway's money still funds half the town's infrastructure. His endowment pays for the schools, the hospital, the roads. It's all tied to the library's continued operation. If the library closes, the money stops. Crestwood would collapse economically. So the town turns a blind eye, and the library board ensures that night archivists are always desperate enough or naive enough to take the job. She finished her coffee and set the mug down with a decisive click. You survived your first night by following the written rules perfectly. Most people break at least one, usually out of curiosity or disbelief. You took it seriously from start. That's good. It means you might actually last long enough to learn how to truly navigate this place. How long did you work nights? I asked. Patricia smiled sadly. I never did. I'm day staff. Always have been. The things that walk these halls at night stay dormant during business hours. The worst we deal with is the occasional cold spot or flickering light. But I've trained 37 night archivists over the years. You're the first one to make it through a full shift and still want to come back for more. That takes either courage or stupidity, and I haven't decided which. After Patricia left, I drove home through empty streets washed in morning light. Everything looked aggressively normal. People walking dogs, joggers, a garbage truck making its rounds. The mundane world going about its mundane business, completely unaware that just a few blocks away, a library contained horrors that would shatter their understanding of reality. I slept fitfully through the day, my dreams filled with whispering voices and gray, faces pressed against windows. When I woke at 4 p.m., I spent 3 hours researching Jeremiah Holloway, compiling everything I could find about the man who had built the library and imprisoned his daughter in eternal half-life. The historical record painted him as a philanthropist and scholar, a wealthy industrialist who had made his fortune in railroads and steel. His personal life had been marked by tragedy. His wife had died in childbirth with Elizabeth, leaving him to raise his brilliant daughter alone. Contemporary accounts described his devotion to Elizabeth as obsessive, his entire world revolving around her education and welfare. When Elizabeth was diagnosed with tuberculosis at age 19, Jeremiah had consulted every specialist, traveled to every sanatorium, tried every experimental treatment. Nothing worked. She was dying, wasting away day by day, and Jeremiah couldn't accept it. The timeline suggested he'd become desperate in the summer of 1903, traveling to the site where the library now stood and conducting some kind of ritual or ceremony. The land had belonged to the indigenous Potawatomi tribe before being seized by settlers, and local legends spoke of it as a cursed place, a thin spot where the boundary between worlds was weak. What Jeremiah had done there, what bargain he'd struck, was lost to history. But the result was clear. Elizabeth had died in September 1903, and the library had opened in March 1904. On the surface, a grieving father's tribute to his lost daughter. In truth, a prison built to contain her spirit and feed whatever had agreed to preserve her consciousness beyond death. I arrived for my second shift at 9:50 p.m., 10 minutes earlier than the night before. I'd followed Patricia's advice and brought nothing personal, leaving my phone in the car along with my wallet and keys. I carried only what I needed: the written rules, a pen, and the inventory list. Patricia met me at the staff entrance, and I saw approval in her eyes when she noticed my empty pockets. "Smart," she said. "Remember, map the building, follow the rules, never try to help. Those 3 principles will keep you alive." The library felt different on the second night, more watchful, more aware of my presence. The temperature drop when I stepped inside was immediate and severe, my breath fogging in the air. But now I understood that the cold wasn't a malfunction of the heating system. It was them drawing heat from the environment, feeding on the warmth of the living. I spent the first hour methodically exploring the first floor, sketching a rough map, and noting which doors were present and which had vanished since my tour with Patricia. 3 doors had disappeared: a coat closet near the main entrance, a storage room behind the circulation desk, and a side exit that had supposedly led to a garden. In their places were unbroken expanses of wall, as if the doors had never existed. At 11:03 p.m., I discovered a new door that hadn't been there the night before. It was set into the west wall of the fiction section, simple and modern compared to the library's Victorian architecture. A small brass plate identified it as special collections. When I tested the handle, it turned easily, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. This wasn't the basement door, which according to Patricia's descriptions should be near the reference room, heavy and iron-banded. This was something else, some new permutation of the building's fluid architecture. I marked it on my map with a question mark and moved on, resisting the urge to investigate. Curiosity had killed more than cats in this building. At 11:47 p.m., Elizabeth appeared at her usual table. I'd been expecting her, and I kept my eyes carefully averted, focusing on my inventory work. But I could feel her attention on me, heavy and desperate. Tonight, she looked more substantial, more present, as if she was drawing energy from somewhere. Her dress rustled as she turned pages, a sound that shouldn't be possible for a ghost. At midnight, the whispers began right on schedule, but they were different tonight. More organized, more coherent. They seemed to be forming words in English, though I had to strain to make them out. "Help us. Free us. Remember us. Don't let us be forgotten. Please, please, please." The desperation in those whispered voices was heartbreaking. How many spirits were trapped here? Was it just Elizabeth, or had others been caught in the binding, snared by Jeremiah's bargain and unable to escape? Dorothy Marsh's reports had hinted at multiple entities, but she'd never been certain whether they were separate spirits or different manifestations of Elizabeth's fractured consciousness. At 12:34 a.m., I made a mistake. I was working through the history section when I found another fallen journal, this one lying open on the floor between shelves. Rule number 5 was clear: leave fallen books where they lie. But the page visible was dated yesterday, written in fresh ink that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. That was impossible. These were historical documents, protected archives. Nothing in this section should be less than 50 years old. I bent down to look closer, not touching, just reading. The handwriting was different from the 1904 journal, more modern, more frantic. The entry read, "Third night. The whispering is getting louder, And I think I'm starting to understand what they're saying. They wanted to open the basement door. They say there's something down there that can free them, something that Jeremiah buried along with whatever he made his bargain with. I know I shouldn't listen, but what if they're right? What if there's a way to end this? Dorothy M. Dorothy Marsh. This was her journal, or a manifestation of it, placed here for me to find. But by whom? Elizabeth? The thing in the basement? Or was the library itself trying to communicate, showing me fragments of its own history? I stood up quickly and stepped back, following the rule, leaving the journal on the floor. But the damage was done. I'd read it. I'd engaged with it. And now I knew something I shouldn't. There was a way to free the trapped spirits. Something in the basement could break the binding. At 1:15 a.m., the footsteps on the second floor started early, an hour ahead of their usual schedule. They were faster tonight, more agitated, as if whatever walked up there knew I'd found the journal and was responding to my knowledge. The pattern was different too. 15 steps forward, pause, 15 steps back. The number had changed. At 2 a.m., the no coughing hour began, and right on schedule, my throat began to burn. But this time I was prepared. I brought cough drops, had been sucking on them since midnight, keeping my throat coated and soothed. The urge was manageable, uncomfortable, but bearable. At 2:37 a.m., someone called my name again, but it wasn't Elizabeth's cultured voice. It was my grandmother's voice, warm and familiar, exactly as I remembered it. "Alex, sweetheart, why are you ignoring me? Come talk to your grandmother. I missed you so much. I have things to tell you, important things. Come to the reference room, dear. Come see Jeremiah's portrait. He wants to meet you." I pressed my hands over my ears, humming loudly to block out the voice, breaking my own silence rule because the alternative was worse. Rule number 10 was absolute. Never answer when someone calls your name, even if it sounds like someone you love, especially if it sounds like someone you love. At 3 a.m., the lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Rule number 9. If the lights flicker 3 times in succession, move to a different section immediately. I abandoned the history section and walked quickly toward the staff kitchen, my safe haven. But when I reached the door, I found it was gone. Smooth walls stood where the entrance should have been, the building's architecture shifting to cut off my retreat. I was exposed, vulnerable, with no designated safe space. The footsteps overhead stopped. The whispering went silent. Even the ambient creaking and settling of the building ceased. In that absolute vacuum of sound, I heard something new, the sound of a door opening. The basement door, heavy iron hinges grinding after decades of being sealed. The sound came from the direction of the reference room, echoing through the empty halls with the finality of a coffin lid lifting. Something that had been locked away was emerging, drawn by the flickering lights, by my presence, by the disturbance in the library's carefully maintained equilibrium. I ran, not toward any exit, because I knew the exterior doors would be locked, the windows sealed. I ran toward the only place that felt marginally safe, the circulation desk, with its pool of light and open sight lines. If something was coming for me, I wanted to see it approach. I made it to the desk and stood with my back to the wall, breathing hard, watching the shadows between the shelves. The library stretched out before me, vast and dark and full of things that shouldn't exist. Somewhere in that darkness, the basement door stood open. Somewhere in that darkness, something ancient and hungry was climbing stairs, moving through rooms, searching. At 3:23 a.m., I saw it. It emerged from the hallway leading to the reference room, and my mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling 15 feet above. Its body was wrong, proportioned in ways that defied human anatomy, with limbs that bent at too many joints and fingers that were far too long. Its face, if you could call it that, was a shifting mass of shadows that occasionally resolved into features that looked almost human, almost familiar, before dissolving again into darkness. It moved with horrible purpose, gliding rather than walking, its form leaving trails of cold vapor in the air. And it was looking for me. I could feel its attention sweeping through the library, searching for the warmth of living flesh, the spark of life that it hungered for. I understood now why the night archivists rarely lasted more than a few nights. This was what happened when you caught its attention, when you engaged too deeply with the library's mysteries, when you threatened the delicate balance of the binding. This was the thing Jeremiah Holloway had made his bargain with, the entity that had preserved his daughter's consciousness in exchange for some terrible price. And I had just used up all of my luck. The thing from the basement moved through the library with the patience of something that has waited over a century and can wait a century more. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. I was trapped, cornered in a building that had become a labyrinth designed to keep prey inside. Every exit I could think of would either be sealed or lead me deeper into its domain. I stood frozen at the circulation desk, my mind racing through possibilities and finding none that offered hope. The rules hadn't prepared me for this. The rules had been about avoiding attention, maintaining the delicate balance, staying invisible. But I'd broken that balance by reading Dorothy's journal, by learning too much, by threatening to uncover the truth that the library board in the town of Crestwood had spent over a century concealing. The entity paused at the edge of the reading room, its shadow form rippling like oil on water. For a moment, I saw faces in the darkness of its mass. Jeremiah Holloway's severe features, Elizabeth's desperate gray visage, Dorothy Marsh's terrified expression, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. All the people who had been consumed by this place, absorbed into its hungry void, their identities dissolved, but their suffering preserved forever. That's when I understood the true horror of what Jeremiah had done. He hadn't just imprisoned his daughter. He'd fed her to this thing, used her as an anchor, a lure, a constant source of living consciousness to keep it satisfied. And every night archivist who had worked here, everyone who had broken the rules or stayed too long or looked too deeply, had been added to the collection. We weren't employees. We were offerings. The entity began to move toward me again, and I made a decision born of pure desperation. If the basement door was open, if the binding had been disturbed, then maybe the other rules were also suspended. Maybe the boundaries had shifted enough that I could do something impossible. I ran, not toward an exit, but toward the grand staircase, toward the third floor, Elizabeth's domain, the one place the written rules explicitly forbade during certain hours. If the entity wanted to feed on living consciousness, then maybe I could find an ally in another trapped spirit. Elizabeth had been trying to communicate with me, calling my name, leaving messages. What if she wasn't trying to trap me? What if she was trying to warn me? I took the stairs 3 at a time, my footsteps thundering in the silence, breaking every rule about maintaining quiet. Behind me, I heard the entity's response, a sound like wind through a graveyard, a chorus of voices crying out in hunger and recognition. It was following, but it was still moving with that terrible patience, as if it knew I had nowhere to go. The third floor was different from the levels below. The architecture here made no pretense of normalcy. Hallways branched off in impossible directions, doors stood at odd angles, and the ceiling was sometimes high enough for a cathedral, and sometimes so low I had to duck. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with rhythmic precision. This was the heart of the binding, the place where reality was most distorted by Jeremiah's bargain. I found Elizabeth in what appeared to be a study, though the room's dimensions kept shifting subtly, making me dizzy. She sat at a desk covered in open books, her gray form more solid here than anywhere else in the library. When I entered, she looked up, and for the first time, I saw recognition in those hollow eyes. Not hunger, recognition. You read Dorothy's journal, she said, her voice no longer the cultured whisper from the reading room, but something more human, more real. You know what he did to me? What I've become? The thing from the basement is coming, I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. The door opened. I don't know how to stop it. Elizabeth stood, and the books on her desk began to flutter, pages turning by themselves, words lifting from the paper and swirling through the air like autumn leaves. He's been waiting for someone like you, someone curious enough to seek the truth, but not foolish enough to try to free me immediately. Someone who would disturb the balance just enough to give him an opening. Him, not it. My father, Elizabeth said, and her form flickered, showing me glimpses of the young woman she'd been. Vibrant, alive, full of intellectual fire. He didn't make a bargain with some ancient evil, Alex. He became the evil. When I died, he couldn't accept it. He performed a ritual he'd found in books that should never have been written, books that detailed how to transcend mortality by feeding on the consciousness of others. He bound my spirit to this place to anchor himself, to give himself a permanent source of sustenance. Every night archivist, every person who works here after dark, they're not running from some monster in the basement. They're feeding my father's immortality. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Jeremiah Holloway hadn't died. He'd transformed, becoming something that existed in the spaces between life and death, sustained by the suffering of trapped spirits and the fear of living prey. The portrait in the reference room wasn't a memorial. It was a window, a way for him to observe his domain. The rules weren't protection. They were instructions on how to be the perfect victim, how to display enough vulnerability to be interesting, but enough obedience to be controlled. Dorothy almost figured it out. Elizabeth continued. She was going to go public, to expose what was happening here. That's why they sealed the basement door after her incident. Not to trap something down there, but to give the illusion that the danger was contained. To make people think there was a monster that could be locked away. But you can't lock away what permeates every stone of this building. Then how do I escape? I asked. The sounds from below were growing closer, the rhythmic patience giving way to something more aggressive. Jeremiah knew I was talking to Elizabeth, learning the truth. He was coming to silence me permanently. You can't escape the building. Not tonight. The exits are sealed until dawn, part of the original binding. But you can escape him. Elizabeth moved toward one of the walls, and it rippled at her touch, revealing a narrow passage I hadn't noticed before. There's a way to sever the anchor, to break the binding that keeps me trapped here. If you do that, the entire structure collapses. My consciousness goes free, and my father loses his primary food source. It won't destroy him, but it will weaken him enough that he'll have to retreat, to hibernate, to rebuild his strength. You'll have time to escape, and he won't be able to maintain the building's warped architecture without me. What do I have to do? In the sub-basement, below where the sealed door leads, there's a chamber. That's where he performed the original ritual, where he bound me. There's an object there, a book bound in leather that isn't leather, written in ink that isn't ink. You have to destroy it, burn it, tear it apart, scatter it. Without that anchor, the binding breaks. But if the basement door is open, won't he be waiting there? Elizabeth smiled sadly. He's up here, hunting you. The basement is empty. He had to leave it unguarded to pursue you to the third floor. That's why I called you up here, Alex. I've been trapped for 122 years, and you're the first person desperate enough and brave enough to actually make it to my sanctum. You're my one chance at freedom. I understood then that I'd been manipulated from the start, but not by Jeremiah, by Elizabeth. She'd been patient, calling out to night archivists for decades, waiting for someone who would survive long enough, learn enough, and be desperate enough to help her. She left the journals, influenced the library's shifting architecture, guided me toward this moment. If I free you, I said slowly, what happens to the others? All the spirits he's consumed. I don't know, Elizabeth admitted. They might go free. They might cease to exist. Or they might remain trapped in him forever, conscious but helpless. But I know that if we do nothing, you'll join them. And after you, there will be another night archivist, and another, for as long as Crestwood needs Holloway money and the library board keeps covering up the truth. The sounds from the stairwell intensified. Jeremiah was close now, moving faster, abandoning his patient stalking for direct assault. I had seconds to decide. I took the passage Elizabeth had revealed. It was narrow and cold, the walls pressing close on either side, the air thick with the smell of old earth and older magic. I descended stairs that shouldn't exist, moving deeper into the building, past the ground floor, past the basement level, into substructures that predated the library itself. This was the foundation Jeremiah had built upon, the thin place where the boundary between worlds was weak. The chamber at the bottom was small and circular, with walls carved from bedrock. In the center sat a stone altar, and on that altar lay the book Elizabeth had described. It was massive, at least 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, bound in something that looked like human skin stretched over wooden boards. The pages were thick vellum covered in writing that hurt to look at, symbols that seemed to crawl and writhe when I tried to focus on them. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the book, and it was shockingly light, as if it was hollow. The moment my hands touched it, I felt a connection snap into place, felt Jeremiah's attention swing toward me like a searchlight finding its target. He knew what I was doing. I heard him coming, his footsteps now thunderous as he abandoned all pretense of stealth, racing through the twisted passages to stop me. But I was already moving, already climbing back up the narrow stairwell, the book clutched against my chest. Its surface was warm, almost feverish, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I emerged on the first floor and ran for the staff kitchen, hoping the room had reappeared now that the architecture was in flux. It had. The door stood open, and inside, on the counter, was the old percolator Patricia used for coffee. Beside it was a box of wooden matches. I heard Jeremiah enter the reading room behind me, heard his true voice for the first time. Give it back. That's mine. My work. My legacy. My immortality. You cannot take it from me. I have earned the right to transcend death. I have paid the price. I didn't answer. I couldn't answer without breaking rule number 10. And even now, even with everything falling apart, some part of me clung to the rules as the only solid thing in a world gone mad. I lit a match. The book caught fire immediately, as if it had been soaked in accelerant, the flames leaping up bright and hungry. The smell was indescribable, burning meat, scorched hair, and something sweet and rotten that made my stomach heave. The pages curled and blackened, the symbols seeming to scream silently as they were consumed. Jeremiah's roar shook the building. The walls cracked, plaster falling from the ceiling, light fixtures swinging wildly. The temperature plunged even further, and I could see ice forming on the windows, frost creeping across the floor. But I held the burning book, letting it consume itself, watching as the binding literally broke, as the magic that had sustained Jeremiah Holloway's unnatural existence for over a century finally unraveled. In the reading room, I heard another sound. Elizabeth's voice, no longer whispering or pleading, but crying out in something that might have been joy or pain or both. Her form appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, and for a moment, she was young again, fully present, fully alive. She looked at me with gratitude beyond words. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she dissolved, not into shadow, but into light, a brightness that filled the kitchen and spilled out into the library, washing away the darkness that had consumed it for so long. Jeremiah's presence collapsed with her liberation. I felt him scatter, his consciousness fragmenting without its anchor, his power dissipating like smoke in wind. He wasn't destroyed, just as Elizabeth had warned. But he was broken, weakened, forced back into whatever liminal space he'd emerged from. The building groaned around me, and I realized that the physical structure was also failing, the warped architecture losing its supernatural support. I dropped the burning book into the sink and ran for the staff entrance, praying it would be accessible now. It was. The door opened easily, and I burst out into the pre-dawn darkness, into air that felt clean and real and blessedly normal. Behind me, I heard the Holloway Memorial Library settling, walls shifting back to their proper positions, rooms contracting to their normal dimensions, the impossible becoming merely old again. I sat on the curb across the street and watched as Patricia's car pulled up at 6:15 a.m. exactly. She got out, looked at me, looked at the library, and I saw her face go pale. She could see the changes, the way the building looked different now, smaller somehow, less oppressive. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I freed her," I said simply. "Elizabeth. She's gone now. They're all gone." Patricia sat down beside me on the curb. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "The library board is going to be furious. Without the binding, without Jeremiah's presence maintaining the endowment, the trust funds will collapse. Crestwood will lose everything." "I know," I said, and I did. By freeing Elizabeth, I'd potentially destroyed the economic foundation of an entire town. But I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Some prices are too high to pay, even for prosperity. "What will you do now?" Patricia asked. I thought about it. I thought about the gray woman who had spent a century reading, about Dorothy Marsh and all the others who had tried to survive this place, about the terrible bargain Jeremiah Holloway had made because he couldn't accept loss. "I'm going to write it down," I said finally. "Everything that happened, everything I learned. Maybe it won't change anything. Maybe people will think I'm making it up. But someone needs to tell Elizabeth's story. Someone needs to remember that she existed, that she suffered, that she's finally free." Patricia nodded slowly. "They'll come after you. The board, the town leadership. They'll try to discredit you, silence you. Let them try," I said. "I worked night shift at a haunted library in Indiana. I faced worse things than lawyers and bureaucrats." As the sun rose over Crestwood, casting light on the Holloway Memorial Library, I saw something I'd never noticed before. The building looked tired. The limestone facade was crumbling in places. The windows were dark and empty, and the whole structure sagged slightly, like something ancient finally allowed to age. The library would probably close soon. The funding would dry up. The board would find excuses, and eventually, it would be condemned and demolished. The town would struggle for a while, then adapt, find new sources of revenue. Life would go on, but Elizabeth Holloway was free, and sometimes that's enough. I quit that morning, officially, handing Patricia a resignation letter I'd written on the back of my incident report. She accepted it without comment, and I drove home through streets filled with people starting their normal days, completely unaware that the world had changed in small but fundamental ways. 3 weeks later, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Alex." The voice was unfamiliar, young, female, hesitant. "My name is Jennifer. I just accepted a position as night archivist at the Holloway Memorial Library. Patricia gave me your number. She said you might be able to tell me what I should know. About the rules." I closed my eyes, my heart sinking. So the library was still operating. The board had found a way to keep it open, probably with emergency funding or desperate measures. And they were still hiring night staff, still feeding people into a building that, while weakened, might not be completely cleansed of its darkness. "Listen to me carefully," I told Jennifer. "Follow every rule exactly. Never break them, even when they seem arbitrary. And if you see a woman reading at a table, if you hear voices calling her name, if you find journals that shouldn't exist, don't investigate. Just survive until dawn and then quit. This job isn't worth whatever they're paying you. But Patricia said you lasted 2 nights. She said you did something that changed the library, made it safer somehow. I did, I admitted. But I don't know if it was enough. I don't know what's still in there, waiting. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll value your life more than your curiosity. There was a long pause. Then, I promise. Thank you, Alex. She hung up, and I sat there holding my phone, wondering if I'd done enough, if my warnings would make a difference, if Jennifer would be another Dorothy Marsh or another name added to the list of victims. The truth is, I'll never know. I'll never go back to the Holloway Memorial Library. That chapter of my life is closed, the book burned, the binding broken. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think I hear whispers. Not malevolent, not hungry, just whispers. And I like to think that they're Elizabeth's, that wherever she is now, whatever peace she's found, she's still reading, still learning, but finally free. And that's worth whatever consequences follow. That's worth everything. The Holloway Memorial Library stands in Crestwood, Indiana, still operating, still hiring desperate people for its night shift. The rules are still posted. The silence is still absolute. But something has changed. Something fundamental has shifted. Whether that change is enough to save the next night archivist, only time will tell. But at least now, they'll have a warning. And sometimes, that's the only thing that stands between survival and becoming another voice in the walls, another whisper in the dark, another spirit trapped in a place where the rules are bizarre, and the night shift never really ends.